Today's webinar here is a continuation of a series that we have been working through. Last week we took you through the top 10 OBIEE security risk, and today we're going to look into WebLogic. Just as a logistics note here, those of you who are registered, we will be sending out a copy of this presentation to everyone who has registered. So if you are trying to keep notes as you go, keep that in mind. So the webinar here, we're going to frame today's conversation initially with a recap of the mechanics or the security mechanics of OBIEE, and then we'll dive into the WebLogic top 10, and then as Phil said, we will take some questions at the end. Just one slide here on integrity for those of you who are not familiar with us, and to also help just put into context what we're sharing with you here today. Integrity has two lines of business. We have our products and our services. Our products are primarily focused in and around the Oracle database, and specifically the Oracle eBusiness Suite, where the AppSentry platform is a security auditing tool, and AppDefend is a purpose-built application firewall for the Oracle eBusiness Suite. The services that we provide are included security assessments, compliance assessment, and security design services. And as you note there, that we do perform OBIEE assessments, and much of what we are sharing with you here today is the net result of those assessments. So enough about integrity, and let's move on here. So to start the conversation, OBIEE is a Fusion middleware product. It sits within WebLogic, and everything to do with how you begin to start to secure OBIEE really starts with how you begin to peel back the onion of how WebLogic has been implemented and what steps have been taken to secure that. Far too often what we are finding, or what we find is, not surprisingly, is what our term is the install and run. Not just the idea that you installed it and got it initially running, but then it's the idea that potentially the consultants have moved on. And the default configurations, the standard decisions or whatever decision processes you went through during that initial install period sometimes are not the best practice, or nor certainly what you might have intended or assumed. WebLogic is a very complex product. The person chosen to be the administrator largely influences the success or how secure the product is ultimately. Whether or not you have tagged your database administrators to be the WebLogic administrators is something to potentially consider. There's distinct new skill sets that need to be mastered with WebLogic, so if you are tagging your DBAs to be the WebLogic administrators, please note that that is something you need to be cognizant of and support them. But the journey here that we've been taking with you as far as how OBIEE works, how the security works, and now that we'll take a look at the WebLogic. Just one note here before we move on. WebLogic is very much at the center of where Oracle is going. WebLogic, not only with the Fusion middleware that OBIEE is deployed within, but the SOA, PeopleSoft, and the Oracle eBusiness Suite, certainly with release 12.2, is also using WebLogic. So WebLogic is really the cornerstone of where Oracle is going, and certainly if you are concerned with or part of your job is to think about the security thereof, that's certainly something to take note of. So those of you who attended last week, this next slide or this slide or the next one will be familiar, but what we are doing here is laying out the major technical components of OBIEE and the size of the box is proportionate to the impact on security. So today we'll be looking at WebLogic and the Fusion Middleware repository up at the top. But for those of you who might not have attended last week, the impact of what is configured within the OBIEE admin tool, that is the window-based tool that is used to configure the RPD file, which is ultimately uploaded into Enterprise Manager, has almost as much influence as WebLogic, but and on the other side there, the OBIEE web catalog certainly has a large impact on security, certainly within the access control list of who can see and run what report and or dashboard. So on one slide here, what we're attempting to do here is really put it all together for you. As far as on the right, we have the authentication, the logon, the initial authorization decisions. For example, can or can you not use OBIEE, and then the handoff into the deployed app. And part of that handshake, so to speak, between WebLogic and OBIEE is that passing in of what application roles and the variables that are passed in, and getting to the point where the end user would then see the catalog. In green, what you see there are the core mechanics of the security that OBIEE defines. You have the access control list, the ACLs, within the catalog that determine who can see what and run what report KPI, who can navigate to what folder. Beyond that, the security that is defined within the RPD file, this is the security features and functionalities that are defined within that Windows-based admin tool. We're primarily talking about permissions and filters. If you are familiar with the three panels, so to speak, on the RPD in the BI admin tool, we have on the left you have the presentation layer, which is the uppermost layer of abstraction, is where you're setting permissions as to who can or what application group can see what, be it a column or a table or a row. The lower levels of abstraction here, actually the lowest level there, the physical tables and columns, is where you are defining, we'll say, probably more of the row filters or even column-based filters if you so wanted to. But the idea is that the RPD file is sitting on top of your data source or data sources. That is where the SQL is defined at the physical layer. You have the meta layers, the business model mapping layer, presentation layer, and each one of these layers you have the ability to set security. WebLogic that we're going to be looking at today here, we're going to be taking a little bit more look at what is tagged as 2 and 3 on the left there as far as the authentication and the OPSS. Again, we are going to be sending a copy of this deck out to all of you who are registered, so you'll have a copy of this slide certainly. A few more slides here just to help frame some vocabulary that we'll be using. WebLogic thinks in terms of security realms. Think of a security realm as a container in which the common security constructs are defined. So users are defined within the context of a realm, so are groups, and so are attributes with regard to the password lockout or password attempt policy, whether or not you're going to be locked out after 3 attempts or 5 attempts, etc. A very key decision, and this goes back to that install and run situation that we commonly will walk into, is the decision to either use the default out-of-the-box realm that OBIEE comes with, or to create your own. And just one note here, I should have prefixed everything that what we're talking about here today is OBIEE 11G versus 10G. 10G had some, there's significant changes in the security and how OBIEE reacted and works within WebLogic between 10G and 11G. So everything we're talking about here today is 11G. So security realms, everything with regard to configurations of security within WebLogic is defined within a security realm. Oracle Platform Security Services, OPSS. The OPSS services transcend all of the Fusion Middleware products. So what we were talking about there earlier, as far as WebLogic being a cornerstone for the Oracle Enterprise on a go-forward basis here, you need to think about what is OPSS providing as far as OBIEE in this case, but we could easily have other boxes down at the bottom for SOA, for Oracle eBusiness Suite 12.2, etc. When you get into OPSS, though, what you need to be aware of are really the boxes on the right. We have the internal LDAP, we have the system policy, the policy store, and we have the credential store. The credential store is just an Oracle wallet that's stored within the WebLogic file system. The policy store, I've noted there for you, is defined within the XML file as noted. The identity store is either the internal LDAP that comes out of the box or potentially an external LDAP. You very well in your organization might have a centralized LDAP repository, possibly even integrated in with your Active Directory. The decisions you make with regard to OPSS and the security vulnerabilities, as noted here, they transcend all of Fusion Middleware products. So you need to be concerned with certainly decisions made. Any decision with regard to OPSS is a serious decision. Another vocabulary word here is application roles. The applications roles as defined within the Enterprise Manager tool, these applications are shared across all Fusion apps. So the application role that you're defining inside of OBIEE or for OBIEE, for example, could be spelled the same exactly as potentially Oracle eBusiness Suite responsibilities, such that you could map security rules or have security rules cascade out of the Oracle eBusiness Suite into OBIEE through application roles that are spelled or at least match that of the Oracle eBusiness Suite product. You then, within Enterprise Manager, map these application roles to LDAP groups. And the key decision, again, here is whether or not you are going to be building off the default application roles or whether or not you're defining net custom. The documentation and decisions that you make in the documentation you create and the decisions you make in your implementation here largely are going to set the foundation for success. Certainly with regard to security, being conscious of how the inheritance works. For what I have on the right there, as far as some very simplistic hierarchy there, we have the idea of a consumer, a BI author, and an administrator with increasing levels of privileges there. We'll come back to this concept in a moment, but I did want to, at the beginning of this presentation, just acknowledge application roles. One slide here, just to hopefully pull that together a little bit, as far as we have permissions and grants inside of OBIEE mapped on a one-to-one basis to application roles. That mapping is then done. That mapping is done in Enterprise Manager, where you are also mapping to LDAP groups. So that is a quick tour of, we'll say, the WOW, or the way Oracle works, or the way OBIEE works as far as the mechanics. I did want to start the presentation with those few slides. With regard to the top 10 lists here that we're now going to be sharing with you, this list, as noted, is the result of client assessments as well as our own research. What we have selected to share with you here today is twofold, really. What we believe, certainly what we've seen is risk to OBIEE information disclosure risks, for example, through sensitive data, risk of Social Security numbers, exposing of Social Security numbers and or credit cards, as well as those topics that should be discussed during an implementation or can be pragmatically addressed today. OBIEE is a large and complex product. There are certainly many more items than 10 as far as security risk, but what we wanted to share with you here today is a top 10 list of things that either one you should be talking about or should have spoken about, or things that you could probably pragmatically address in short order. So that's the list is, and we have slides to go through each one of these here as far as poor patching policies, file system security, how you start and run WebLogic, hardening, administration of WebLogic, change control, logging and auditing, authentication, the metadata, and following up with WebLogic scripting. So let's break this down here and start here by noting that that WebLogic server versions here, the 10.3.5 versus 10.3.6. Let's just note that the grace period for 10.3.5 ended in August 2013. If you are running 10.3.5, you really shouldn't be, especially if you are internet facing. 10.3.6 has some legs on it. We'll get you out to 2021 there. That is the terminal patch set for 11G. And last but not least, there are CPU patches for WebLogic and the Fusion middleware. You need to keep current with your CPU patches, certainly if you are internet facing. A few of our assessments of late, we had some customers that were running OBIEE 1116, and that came with the 10.3.5. So this was something that we've certainly run into in the last 6 months or so of people actually running 10.3.5. Also want to note here Java 1.6 versus 1.7. I'll harp back again on the, if you are internet facing, there are risks and vulnerabilities with regard to 1.6 that you should seriously consider keeping current on 1.7. File system access. If you are looking at the WebLogic file system for the first time, it is daunting. There are multiple directories where when you get into the second and third level, they appear identical to other trunks, so to speak, within the file system, other branches. And while you first might think that Oracle was just throwing in a few extra file systems just for the fun of it, there is some logic to it. You certainly need to, when you think about the security of the file system, when we say that be sure that only the appropriate people have access, you need to be sure that those appropriate people, as one of the criteria, is whether or not they are familiar with the file system, more so to protect yourself against accidents and or confusion, certainly in a production environment. But the security, the underlying operating system, we're talking about best practices, that's warrants probably another security top 10 presentation, so we won't go into, let's say, Linux best practices. But really what we're getting to here is the Fusion middleware home. Who can get into these directories? Unlike what if you're coming out of the database world where it would, in comparison, look clean as far as where to go, as far as configurations, looking into the data dictionary, for example, to see configs. WebLogic is not such. WebLogic is really a set of config files, ini files, XML files spread over multiple directories, and though you might be tempted to to edit some of these files, the unintended consequences can be dire, as well as for security purposes, literally anything, if you have full access to the file system, you certainly have full access to manipulate anything within OBIEE. So in the blue there we have the primary directories that are underneath the Fusion middleware home, and we've called out in the text there as far as what is in there. For example, the RPD files would be in your / instances, as well as some of the key security access control lists. You want to carefully limit, as I said, that people have a file system access. At minimum, you need to be concerned with UMass 066 as far as Linux permissions. More or less, just to translate, U066 is that you're going to allow others access to execute, but not necessarily to modify or read files. So you need to be very careful with regard to who has operating system access, and certainly some of the key configuration files, the boot properties, there's a longer list certainly than 3 here. One doc here that I've noted that is above and beyond what you might find on Oracle support or the Oracle documentation site is that the National Security Agency has a data doc, but probably still relevant with regard to WebLogic security. I provided the URL there. Again, this presentation will be emailed out to everyone who is registered here today. But this doc does walk you through, at least from the NSA's perspective, a few checklists that you probably would find useful. Moving on, the decision to how to run WebLogic. You need to start up WebLogic in such a way that it cannot be exploited. You don't certainly want to run WebLogic as root, nor any other privileged account. And so how you start up WebLogic and the scripts you use and the decisions you made, we've called out here a couple of the options. There are MetaLink support notes in and around this topic. If you are thinking about how you're doing this today, you might need to go verify. Commonly, what I'll go back to the install and run. This is something that we find not every day, but it's not uncommon to find WebLogic running as an account that it shouldn't be. Not hardened. So I have a few slides on this. As you can imagine, this topic is probably much more significant if you are internet facing, more so than just the security realm and understanding the attributes that are being used to govern security. We'll start with that. But the idea that Oracle does provide a lot of sample and demo applications. These should not be installed in production. Some of these demo applications have default accounts with well-known passwords. You don't want those in your production environment for reasons such that somebody could exploit them to gain access to WebLogic and to parts of WebLogic. Aside from that, just the general principle, you should have a separate environment for test and production. If you are internet facing, or even if you're not, there's some good cases to use. A good best practice would dictate that a web application firewall is in use, and certainly if you are internet facing, a requirement. We've actually, again, a few of our assessments, we've actually seen this where somebody has OBIEE outside the firewall and public facing, and there's WebLogic, there's no web application firewall, and there are all the exploits or cross-site scripting and or SQL injection, other things that the web application firewall would potentially mitigate and or stop. Continuing on this, as far as attributes, the robots page not configured. Every website has a robots.txt page. This page gives instructions to indexers such as Google and or Bing or Yahoo as far as what parts of what pages should be indexed and which pages should not be. If you are internet facing, you certainly want to have robots txt probably set to **** such that you want to block everything. You don't need to have Google indexing all of the, we'll say, publicly available sites that or pages that you have set up. Likewise, the powered by, most websites, more so than just the about this page that you might see visibly, but if you look into the HTTP header strings, you can see attributes that'll let you know what, for example, that you're running WebLogic and what version of WebLogic is not something you want to publicly advertise. Security best practice would be to set that to none. There's actually some MetaLink notes, instructions on how to do that, to set the powered by to none. If you're so interested, or if you can't find that, please let us know. And last but not least, the idea though, even if you do have a test or a development instance, you don't need to keep those publicly available all the time. So if you are internet facing and you do have a test environment, best practice, or we would encourage you to think about only placing that or only allowing internet access to that during your test period and then shutting it down. There's no need for an additional attack surface to be exposed if it's so not necessary. Something else that we've seen with regard to WebLogic are internal services being publicly exposed. And I actually have a few examples of this that I want to share with you as far as I've queued up. I have here just a clean Firefox version here, and we have some URLs that we have found in the past as being publicly accessible. So if you think about how this would start, we have the idea that port 7001, if we look at this is actually going to then, while that is taking its time, I'll queue up one of these other ones. Actually, I think I'm going to skip that for now. The web services, what services you are publicly running as far as the web services here. BI content, BI admin services. This list of internal URLs, if I were to provide you the full listing, is probably about 60 or 70 or so URLs that we regularly test. Certainly, most of these, if you're internet facing, you want to be blocking, and certainly you don't want to be natting those or translating them into internal addresses. Administration users. So WebLogic again comes out of the box with a default set of groups. These groups have some accounts that are seeded. Let's say during the WebLogic install there is a user called WebLogic, or at least you are prompted to create the WebLogic user. You can type in the word WebLogic, or we would encourage you to consider a more, we'll say, not so obvious name. You're not required to use WebLogic as a keyword as a user, for example. But you need to have the appropriate size team. So if you have 12 or 15 people with admin rights or full admin rights to WebLogic, you want to make sure that, okay, are those, certainly if it's a production instance, is that appropriate to have that community, to have all of those people have the admin rights. For example, if they're just deploying apps on deploying new RPDs or other such administration tasks, infrequently to call that list down. And certainly if the people have left the organization or changed jobs, you want to make sure that that list is clean. Also, weak password. and the rotation of the key WebLogic passwords. That's something to keep in mind. Again, this is something actionable that we want to share with you as far as make sure the list of administration users is appropriate and that these key passwords that are supporting WebLogic, certainly at the file system level, are being appropriately governed. Weak change control. So how you propagate new RPDs from a test environment to a production environment is part of what we're talking about here, but more so, how do you migrate the OPSS, the Oracle Platform Security Services, new application, roles, credentials, policies. How you do this, it could be through a combination of manually manipulating the GUI. You could also be writing WebLogic scripts, WSTs, and you could also use a combination of both. But however you go about doing this, usually what we want to see is that there's a defined policy that is written and that is being followed. That certainly if you are new to WebLogic or potentially only thinking about the how OBIEE is working or not working, sometimes the OPSS change control is not thought about. WebLogic comes out of the box with a very robust set of log and audit functionality. There are pre-built reports. There is a common audit format. It is extensive as far as its flexibility. We recommend that you use it. We recommend certainly that you could start with the defaults and you can take that much further. However you do enable it though, think about taking that a step further. Think about taking that into, if you have ArcSight or Splunk as a centralized log repository or a SIM to pull that information in. We talked last week about OBIEE having its own user tracking, and that also could be streamed to, let's say, Splunk. You really want to think about both being pulled in such that you have visibility into the authentication of users, and then from OBIEE with the running, and then also for your privileged users, your WebLogic administrators, to have the appropriate WebLogic auditing pulling that in. How you enable that, also, as I said, you could report on WebLogic log data, not just in Splunk and ArcSight, but there's also functionality to use Oracle BI Publisher to expose that to if you don't have Splunk or ArcSight. The moral to the story here is make sure that you're using auditing if you're not. Multiple authenticators. So if you remember one of the pictures at the beginning there, we have this relationship with OBIEE depending upon WebLogic for the authentication. One of the questions that Phil's going to ask, sorry Phil, I'll steal your thunder here. One of the questions we received from somebody who asked a question when they were registering for this webinar is how come OBIEE or how come WebLogic doesn't have a we'll say self-service forgot password functionality? And how I would answer that is that OBIEE is really designed to be blind to authentication. It's totally dependent upon WebLogic to do that. And WebLogic itself is just built to consume, even to be largely blind to that and consume identities from externally. So if you have an external LDAP or identity vault, it's going to depend upon that. You can certainly set up WebLogic and OBIEE to depend upon a single, let's say, identity store, or maybe you have a federated approach where you have multiple identity stores where somebody's identity is, let's say, fragmented across multiple, it could be LDAP repositories, and then when it's combined, let's say, within those security filters within OBIEE, that certain decisions about what you can and can't see is based upon those federated or slices of identity from multiple pieces. Provisioning and deprovisioning of identities can get complex. Certainly maybe more complex than you first or might realize. If you don't need an identity store, disable it. Keep it simple. The out-of-the-box default, if you are not using it, turn it off. That's certainly something we've seen there. Metadata repository. So WebLogic has certainly, I want to say most of its configurations are stored within the file system, or certainly the most important configurations from a security perspective that I have found are locked up on those INI files and XML files within the file system within that Fusion middleware home. But Fusion middleware products require a SQL repository as well. It needs not be Oracle. It could be a SQL Server database. It could be potentially even a MySQL database, I think. And there is a client-server tool that helps you administer the SQL repository. Bottom line, though, most likely, if you're on the phone here today, it's an Oracle database. Regardless of the type of database, you need to make sure that that database is secured, it's following best practice, that it's patched. If it's an Oracle database, that it's following has the latest CPU patches. But specifically for OBIEE, there's no real need to give access to developers to those schemas. Common issues that we find within our assessments is that this metadata repository is not patched, logging is not enabled on it, and that it's the install and run scenario where the developers have, at least the passwords and/or have found other uses for that database and/or those schemas. WebLogic scripting. So as DBAs use SQL, WebLogic administrators use WebLogic scripts. For those of you not familiar with WebLogic scripts, it's a command line tool. It's JSON, a variant of Java as far as its syntax. There's on and offline modes. It's very powerful. Anything that you can do within the user interface, certainly as far as security, you can do with a script. The security framework enforces theoretically the same whether or not you're going through the GUI or WebLogic scripts, but there's some things that we wanted to share with you here today as far as more so than just don't hard code credentials in these scripts, but think about who is using these scripts, what these scripts are doing, and the change control around them. Just as a quick example of a WebLogic script for those of you who might not have seen one before, I'm going to just pull one over here. This is a quick script here that just lists out users and groups. A couple of things I want to point out to you here is that I need to connect for online mode to run these reports here, and I have my username and password here. What I'm not doing here is I'm not putting in the username and password here on the connect, right? I'm actually loading in the username and passwords from a variable out of a file that I have created on the file system called the properties file. If you're an auditor, you need to certainly be concerned with how, if your team is using WebLogic scripts, are they certainly hard coding passwords, but then how such property files, where they're located in the file system, how they're protected, but then take also be cognizant of what these scripts are doing. As far as you might have some simple scripts for startup and shutdown. You might have other scripts for assisting with migrations, or some administrators might just prefer to use WebLogic scripts for everything. Certainly, it's worth a look, and I wanted to share this with you here. This is actually a bonus. This is the 11th item. I wanted to include it, though, as far as not commonly do we found have we seen this, we'll say in the wild, but the ability that WebLogic is a J2EE application server. WebLogic is largely assembled from mbeans, and you can set up remote access into mbeans. through the JMX console. So if I, from my laptop, install the the J console, and I have credentials, this means that I can remotely manipulate WebLogic, similar to either having a WebLogic scripts or sitting from the browser GUI. If this is enabled at your environment, you need to think about whether or not you've set up a password to be required this on and whether or not you've set other attributes as far as allowing it but only read-only. Some MetaLink notes on this as well. If you have some questions, certainly on this, please ask. But I did want to share that with you. So coming up on 45 minutes here. Again, this top 10 list was a combination of things that we've seen and also items that we wanted to share with you as far as if you haven't had the discussion, you should. So Phil, what do we have for questions?
Thank you, Michael. A couple questions here. The first one is, how do you patch WebLogic?
WebLogic comes with its own set of patch utilities. The question I'm assuming is that whoever is asking that is aware of that, and probably the question is more coming from, you know, what's the best practice. So you have WebLogic, you have OBIEE deployed within that, and then many times you have, let's say, the Oracle e-business suite as a data source. So you need to choreograph how you're going to go about patching that and making sure that the certifications of all work from the operating system into WebLogic into OBIEE, which then next step would be a certainly finding the appropriate time to test this and then downtime in production to execute. Hopefully that's how the question was at least being framed. If it's not, please contact and I'd be happy to talk with you more about that.
Okay, next question. How easy is it for a database administrator to learn WebLogic? Should the DBAs be the WebLogic admins or should it be another team?
Well, we've certainly seen a little bit of everything here. WebLogic is popping up in many different places, certainly within the e-business suite with 12.2. We've had this conversation a number of times. Should the WebLogic administrators, should the DBAs be tagged also to be WebLogic administrators? WebLogic is a large and complex product. Likewise, there's the pragmatic reality of your staff. So whoever is, if your DBAs are strong and have some certainly time to buy the learning curve, I would encourage, okay, maybe that's something to try out. But if not, seriously consider grooming somebody to be a WebLogic administrator. It could be a developer who, again, there's a learning curve, or it could be somebody who's coming in the door with a skill set.
Next question. Does WebLogic support Kerberos authentication?
Kerberos. Yes, it does. Kerberos, for those of you on the call here, is an authentication protocol. It's actually been part of Windows for the better part of the last 10 years. We have set up Kerberos authentication for database. It used to be that the Oracle database required you to buy the ASO license to use Kerberos authentication. Within the last year, certainly within the last year, that is now free with the Enterprise Edition of Oracle. And for example, you could log on to an Oracle database through SQL Plus just using your AD credentials. WebLogic does have Kerberos authentication. I have not set that up, but if someone was so interested, I'd be happy to test that in the lab.